The Wall Street Journal took a lot of flack for reporting on Joe Biden's age symptoms before it was trendy. But if you've been paying attention, the Wall Street Journal wasn't the only one covering it. A lot of media, including mainstream liberal media that were accused of running cover for the White House on this story, had been chronicling his decline for years. Welcome to Newspeak, I'm Holly Kellum. So obviously, because of what I do for a living, I read a lot of news. And also because of what I do for a living, I follow a lot of media critics who, like me, are reading the news and then dissecting what they see. So I was pretty surprised when I saw a lot of media critics' reaction to this Wall Street Journal story on how behind closed doors, Biden has shown signs of slipping. Their criticism went like this. The Wall Street Journal had a bunch of anonymous sources, some of them Democrats, but only one Republican on record. Furthermore, according to the New York Times, that Republican on record, former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, was said to have told allies he found Biden to be mentally sharp in meetings. Now, never mind that those allies are anonymous in the New York Times story as well, or that he was quoted in the same New York Times article as saying Biden had delusionally claimed he fixed the border.
Because, oh no, I fixed it. It was broken. I fixed the border.
Now, going back to the Wall Street Journal story, what the media critics I follow were upset about is that not only did this story reek of a Republican attack, but that it was picked up by Sinclair Broadcast Corp, which owns a bunch of local TV news stations.
As the Wall Street Journal is out with reporting calling into question the mental fitness of President Biden.
The Wall Street Journal is out with new reporting
calling into question the mental fitness of President Joe Biden.
Calling into question the mental fitness of President Joe Biden.
The issue could be an election decider.
The issue could be an election decider.
The Substack Popular Information claimed Sinclair was injecting deceptive attacks on Biden's age. Margaret Sullivan, a media critic for The Guardian, claimed this was taking a wrecking ball to public trust in local journalism, calling the Wall Street Journal story slanted. The Washington Post published an opinion piece saying this was injecting propaganda into local news, and the readout called these misleading attacks on Biden's age.
Local anchors teed up a segment based on a recent dubious Wall Street Journal report about the president's acuity and the election, all with a virtually identical script.
Now, I agree that it's best not to use anonymous sources, but the Wall Street Journal could have written that story using more than just sources. There's been a plethora of reporting documenting Biden's decline, and it's based on a lot of what reporters have seen with their own eyes. Take this story in the New York Times, published in 2022. It says more than a dozen current and former senior officials and advisors, which I'll highlight, remain anonymous, say his energy level, while impressive for a man of his age, is not what it was, and some aides quietly watch out for him. He often shuffles when he walks, and aides worry he will trip on a wire. He stumbles over words during public events, and they hold their breath to see if he makes it to the end without a gaffe. He is generally a 5 or 5.5 day a week president. The New York Times also covered Biden falling off his bike, which, yes, actually became a national news story, as did the time he tripped while climbing stairs to Air Force One in Maryland. It was also pretty widely reported that Biden is using a CPAP machine for his sleep apnea, which isn't necessarily an age-related thing, but it's more common in older adults. Last July, Politico reported that a leaders' dinner at the NATO summit was the third such gathering Biden had either skipped or left early in the past year. And last September, Axios reported on the Biden team's Don't Let Him Trip mission. It said he had been wearing tennis shoes more often to avoid slipping and using the short stairs on Air Force One, entering the plane on a lower deck than before. In April, Axios reported that Biden was now walking to Air Force One with an entourage instead of by himself. Some Biden advisors have told Axios they're concerned that videos of Biden walking and shuffling alone, especially across the grass, have highlighted his age. So there was actually a significant amount of reporting, even more than I showed here, about Biden physically atrophying. But I think most people would agree that you can be physically challenged but still mentally very sharp. And that's where I think accusations, especially from the right, that there has been a media cover-up is coming from. And that's because since his 2020 campaign, Biden's mental fitness has been called into question. Now, while I've seen plenty of videos of Biden's verbal flubs and made-up words,
she knew so long as she was denied. When I signed the bipartisan infrastructure again, which I was going to put him
I think why that Wall Street Journal story touched such a nerve is because it spoke directly to the question of whether the president, who is also the presumptive nominee of the Democratic Party, is fit to be in the role for another year, let alone another 4 after that. Now, even in his younger years, Biden has made mistakes, and as someone who I would say also has a genetic predisposition to forgetting proper nouns, I can say from the heart that I sympathize with Biden's affliction. But when you're younger, people write it off as brain farts rather than senior moments, and it doesn't reflect on your capacity as a functioning adult the way it does when you're older. Now, it's hard to say how much the White House press corps, which follows him like a shadow to every campaign and White House press event, knew about Biden's mental decline, but there are inklings that journalists had more knowledge of his mental state than they were reporting. A writer for The Intelligencer wrote that back in January, Biden supporters were questioning whether he could make it to Election Day, let alone another 4 years. They were scared and horrified, but they were also burdened. They needed to talk about it, though not on the record. They needed to know that they were not alone and not crazy. Things were bad, and they knew things were bad, and they knew others must also know things were bad, and yet they would need to pretend outwardly that things were fine. This reporter also said that after shaking Biden's hand at an event this April, she was surprised at how not there he was. His skin and pallor were waxy. Despite the warmth in the room, his hands felt cold, and though his eyes were open, she described them as not being on. Reporters, she said, joked afterward about what % dead he was. Now, it's nice to hear the honesty of the press corps now that the floodgates are open and everyone is openly talking about Biden's symptoms of aging, but was it flying under the radar in the mainstream media before this? To this, I would say yes and no. There were things that were just too blatant to ignore, like when special counsel Robert Hur used Biden's declined mental state as a rationale for not prosecuting him for taking home classified documents after he was vice president. In his report, Hur called Biden an elderly man with a poor memory, and that it would be difficult to convince a jury that they should convict him, by then a former president well into his 80s, of a serious felony that requires a mental state of willfulness. In February, Biden mixed up current French President Emmanuel Macron with former French President François Mitterrand, who died in 1996.
And Mitterrand from France, looked at me and said, you know, how long are you back for?
That was the second time that week he'd mixed up the name of a world leader, and he implied his uncle was likely eaten by cannibals in Papua New Guinea after his plane crashed in World War II. Papua New Guinea's leader pushed back, saying the country does not, as Biden claimed, have a cannibalism problem. Maybe the most painful mistakes he made was failing to recall when his son Beau died, or when he was vice president. That came from a transcript of an interview with her, which could be why, despite having the transcript, the White House fought tooth and nail to keep the recording of the interview out of the public eye. Now, those were all obviously reported by the mainstream media, so you can't say that his signs of aging weren't being covered at all. But I think the question is, if the shoe was on the other foot and a candidate or president like Trump had made those same mistakes, would the reporting have been the same? Now, here I should note that Trump makes flubs and gaffes as well. I can't say if they are more or less than Biden because press access to both men is not equal. While reporters had record access to Trump when he was the president, Biden has avoided the press like the plague. I did a story about Biden's feud with the New York Times over not giving him a sit-down interview with the paper, and that was based off a Politico magazine article that did an in-depth look at that, plus Biden's larger avoidance of the media. But I think what's most telling about the coverage of Biden's age is how one Axios political reporter described going out on a limb when he published stories that other White House correspondents were ignoring.
You know, it's an uncomfortable place to be. And then also, you know, from my perspective, you know, I felt a little bit out on a limb here. And then when you're on a limb, you like look around to see if anyone's going to join you.
No, but there's definitely a sense. I mean, you can perceive it. And actually, I'd like to ask you about it in a sec. But there's definitely a sense that the political class in D.C., for lack of a better term, really didn't want to hear this story. They really didn't want to engage with it.
I think that's fair.
So what do you think about the coverage of Biden's age? Do you think there was just lack of access, or do you think the White House press corps was just too deferential to him? Let me know in the comments below, and if you have something you want me to cover, please let me know in the comments as well. Once again, I'm Kellum, and this is Newspeak.